So how are you? Had a good day? Yeah. My name's Paul. I come from Business SA, which is the Chamber of Commerce. It's an employers membership association here in South Australia. We look after a lot of different businesses' needs as far as paying people correctly, industrial relations type activities, you know. When people get disgruntled at work and they may get fired, or they a business wants advice on moving an employee on, we do a lot of that stuff. But primarily what I deal with is safety in the workplace. My background, I used to work for the government as a safety inspector here in South Australia. So I was a principal inspector there, so I used to go out and investigate all sorts of accidents and incidents in workplaces. Saw some pretty horrific things, people where they'd taken too much risk and ended up getting killed on the workplace, or missing an arm when they stuck their hand in a machine, all those sorts of things, down to, you know, just simple little trip hazards and things like that. I guess for this presentation, it is pretty easy going, so if you've got any questions, don't be frightened to ask them. Hopefully the question isn't, can I go now already? That would be a good thing, wouldn't it? But if you've got a question about anything, please let me know. Ask it through the presentation. I've hit the record button. Yep, beautiful. As far as toilets, emergency evacuation, first aid, all those sorts of things, you're all clear with that sort of stuff, are you? Yep, all good. Beautiful. I'll see how we're going about halfway through. Might have a quick 2-minute, 3-minute break sort of thing. But we'll see how we're going. What I'd like you to do is probably just give us who you are and what's your experience in managing risk management processes. Are you aware what they are, or are you very new to them? So I'm going to pick on the person at the front here. Yep, beautiful. So what's your name, mate? Ahmed. And what have you had to do with risk management before?
Actually, I haven't worked with it.
Pardon?
I haven't worked with this, but I have heard about it.
Yeah, it's certainly a very important process in us all going home at the end of the day, yeah. How about the next person?
My name is Mohammed.
And
I'm still a student. So
yeah.
I haven't had a experience yet.
No. Beautiful.
My name is Nasa, and I'm doing a lecture of health science at University of South Australia. I've done a few subjects about building each other.
Yeah.
I've done industrial relation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So you know a little bit about it. Hopefully this will fill in, you know, some of the stuff that I'm telling you, and it's not too dissimilar.
My name is Aziz. I haven't worked in this area, but I'm studying events management.
Yep.
So I think it's so important.
Very, very important. Very, very important. Up the back there in the middle. Yep. Yeah. So who here has had work experience with risk management? Anyone? Cool. That's good. That means that I can say whatever I like and you're probably going to believe me. And that's a good thing. But really, risk management is the simple process of making sure that people are protected in a workplace environment. And certainly you're in a workplace environment here at the university. The university employs people that have an obligation to your safety as well. There's people that come here and are students to the university.
Excuse me,
Yep.
use the microphone.
Okay.
So for the record.
Yeah, pretty loud anyway, so.
But that's because the recording.
Yep, all right, cool. Do you want me to clip that on?
Yes,
All right, cool. Now you're in trouble. You're going to hear me loud. Is that all right? Yeah, beautiful. So, yeah, certainly risk management is something that's an everyday thing in every workplace. And businesses do it at all different levels. They do it from fairly basic, talk to their workers and try and work out how the safest way to doing things, right down to a real documented system where they risk assess things, they document it, they talk with their staff, they may get consultants involved, expertise involved on how to do things safe. But certainly it's really important that all businesses have some sort of risk management in place. I guess what we're here to try and go through today is outline the hazard management process. Talk about the legislation as well in South Australia. Why we just talk about South Australia? You're all students, you could end up anywhere in Australia working, couldn't you? But recently, Australia really, their legislation has got harmonised quite strongly. So most of the states in Australia, the legislation, the law is the same thing as far as workplace safety. So what I'm telling you here would be told pretty much in every state of Australia, and that's really important. We'll talk about some of the tools there are for identifying hazards and doing risk assessments. And certainly those tools are usually things that you can document so you can show that you've done it, you've done the process. So if something was to go wrong down the track, you'd have some level of evidence that you've thought about these things and try to do the best that you could do. As far as the law in South Australia, it starts with the Work Health and Safety Act, and that spells out duties of different people, duties of workers, duties of the boss, the officers of the business, the people that run the business, duties of the business itself, and then certainly duties of all other people. So everyone that walks onto a work site has a duty as far as work health and safety is concerned. So you as a student, you come on site, what do they provide to you to tell you what the safety rules are? Do they give you an induction? Do they give you some documentation that spells out the rules that you have to follow on the campus? Those rules are very important. They are part of the risk management process. That is the university trying to educate you in what you should do as far as safety is concerned. The WHS Act certainly spells out a lot of things. It details very, very heavy penalties that are associated with businesses and people that don't put in good work safety practices. It talks about ignorance not being an excuse. So because the law is written, it applies to everyone in South Australia. And so every South Australian business must know what's in there, must know what their duties are. It talks about hazard management as well, and that's through the regulations. So there's an act and regulations. In that act and the regulations, it spells out what must be done as far as work health and safety is concerned. So if you've got a big machine with spinning parts that could take your fingers off if you put your fingers in there, the law simply says that that's not acceptable anymore. You must put in processes such as guards, such as training, such as policies and procedures to make sure no one gets their fingers into that machine. And that's a risk management process. The law really reflects that. It tells you that you must do certain steps, and we'll go through those steps this evening. It talks about reasonableness as well. So it doesn't say that, you know, when you've got a machine that's going very, very slowly and it can't do any damage to you, that you put in the same level of guarding and principles that a machine that's spinning at high speed you have to do. So you only have to do what is reasonable based on that risk, or what the law says. It talks about the workplace being anywhere, and I've explained that. So anywhere. If you go to Westfield Shopping Centre, it's a workplace, isn't it? You go to a university, it's a workplace. If you go over to the park here and you've got the council doing particular works and they fence off those areas, that's going to be their workplace for that particular time. If you drive a company vehicle, a truck, a tractor, anything like that, that's going to be your workplace. So your workplace can be anywhere where you have to particularly do your work, and that's really important. Most importantly, the law is there to protect all people, every single person that could be affected by a workplace activity, a workplace machine, those sorts of things. Talks about businesses as being persons conducting businesses or undertakings. It says that they have a duty to manage risks and are required to eliminate all their hazards, all their risks. Now, could you imagine it being possible to eliminate, get rid of all your hazards? So if you looked at this building here, you could say, well, these stairs are a hazard, aren't they? You could trip over them potentially. Imagine if you had to get rid of them. Well, you'd have to close the doors, wouldn't you? Because you need those stairs. So where things can't be eliminated, then it says you must minimise those risks. So those stairs, to minimise those risks, you maintain them, you keep them in a good condition. If they start getting really tatty, that someone could trip down them, then you fix them, you repair them. Simple as that. It says that businesses must be proactive, should not assume that other businesses that share responsibilities should have taken care of work health and safety. So for you guys, you know, you have the university here. You can't just assume that they're taking care of all the safety. We all share a part in that safety. Certainly they have to manage the majority of it, don't they? They have to set the rules, keep the place in a good condition, but you must follow those rules. You share that duty as well. It talks about managing risk, and it uses the words where you have the capacity to influence and control that risk. So those stairs, none of you guys could fix those stairs, could you? They're not your stairs. Wouldn't be fair for you to have to go and fix them if there was some damage there. So whoever's got control and influence over those stairs, it would be the university, they must fix that. But if there was an agreement and arrangement, then someone else could do it. And who would generally the university have an agreement with to, you know, maintain things? They may have a contractor that does that for them, or a business that comes in and manages all the facilities and things like that. So it can be done that way. Doesn't mean the university has to do it all themselves. Talks about reasonably practicable, and this is really the two key words in law in understanding how to be reasonable about fixing things. So it says you must do things that are reasonably able to be done, but you must take into account a likelihood of a hazard or a risk occurring. Who here knows what a hazard is? What's a hazard? Yeah, you're getting there. It's certainly a potential risk of someone being injured. So a source or a situation. So it could be something physical in nature. Like if you go to the Adelaide Zoo, lion. It's a hazard, isn't it? Yeah, it's certainly a danger. You wouldn't want to be free and roaming like in the petting zoo where they've got they've got reindeer and things like that in there, would you? It wouldn't last too long. Wouldn't get too many visitors. So certainly a hazard is that source or an activity. So if you had the council working here and they put up their bunting and they're using excavators and they're using all sorts of machines that were moving in and out, that would be a hazard. And the activities around what they're doing there would be a hazard. They may dig a great big hole. If they don't put that fencing around that hole, that hazard's probably a bit riskier than when they put fencing around it. So you've got to look at the likelihood of the hazard or the risk occurring. You need to look at the degree of harm that it might result. There's no point focusing on everything if you can get a little splinter versus losing your hand. What would you focus on? What hazard? You'd focus on the one you're going to lose your hand first. You wouldn't discount the splinter, but the harm is far less than the other one. It talks about what a person ought to know about the hazard or the risk. Well, if it's in the legislation, if it's written there that you must do certain things, if there's a code of practice that explains what to do, or if there's information, then you must do it. You must meet that compliance level. So you couldn't say, I didn't know about how to deal with that hazard if there was information available. It talks about ways of eliminating or minimising the risk as well. And it also talks about cost. So, you know, you have a look at this lecture theatre here and you go, well, if there was that little step there that was a little bit slippery, would you have to shut down the whole lecture theatre? The cost of that might be disproportionate to that risk. You could put a sign there. You could actually just put some barriers there. So you can do simple things as well. Ultimately, you want to get it fixed, but you can do those little things based on cost as well, because that would be totally disproportionate. So if this was the only lecture theatre and you shut it down, it would cost the university quite a bit of money, wouldn't it? Talks about businesses, and businesses in the new legislation are all corporations, companies, those sorts of things. They can be associations who don't employ workers. They can be partnerships. They can be sole traders or self-employed people. So if you're a self-employed person, you have that duty as a person conducting a business or undertaking, even though you don't have an employee. And also government departments, statutory authorities, they are businesses as well, but they employ people, so they're pretty easy to determine. The primary duty of all businesses in South Australia is to provide and maintain a safe work environment. So what's a work environment to you guys? Anyone? So an environment is the physical things that you're exposed to. In this room we've got quite a few. If I turn the lights off and you had to write notes and read fine text in here, what would that do to your eyes over time? You'd end up with headaches, you'd end up with possible vision issues. So that's one of the environmental things that needs to be maintained. So if you're doing really finite type work, they need to provide good lighting for you, because that's an environmental risk. Of course, the physical flooring, trip hazards, things like that are associated there as well. Systems of work. So they must provide and maintain ways to do your job safely. And that's really important to note. So when you go out there in the workforce and you get your policies, your procedures, get told and shown how to do the job, they're very important. They are part of that business's risk management process. So those policies, those procedures, the way that you're trained in how to do your job is integral so that you can do it the safest way. Because if you're operating a machine, if they just give you the keys and go for it, have fun, what's the chances of you having an accident? Very high, yeah. So that training, that education, the procedures around on how you use that machine are very important. So then when they give you the keys after they're confident that you're able to do it in the manner that they want, then the risk is far lower. There's still a risk. It's still a moving machine. It's still something that could damage you because it's a hazard. But with all those things in place, certainly that risk is minimised. It talks about processes for use, handling and storage of machinery. So they use the terminology plant for machinery. So when you see machinery anywhere in this state, if you looked at work health and safety legislation, they call it plant. So my computer, this sort of stuff here, electrical stuff, the projector over there, that's all plant. It says that they have to have processes for using, handling and storing that plant safely. But they're also substances and structures as well. So buildings have to be provided in a good manner, must be maintained, and your chemicals, those sorts of things. That you have all good processes around them so people aren't exposed to substances that they shouldn't. Talks about information, instruction, training, supervision. Must be provided. Now with the law it says for information, instruction and training that you provide to workers must be readily understood. So for you guys, when you go out there to the workplace, then that has to be in a format that you can understand. So if you don't have a great English speaking ability, or you have a disability, all those sorts of things, the law says then that must be in a manner that you can understand. How you going, guys? It says that adequate facilities such as first aid, emergency response, toilets, dining, all those sorts of things must be provided, must be maintained. There's other duties that businesses do have as well. Now, any of you guys doing engineering, things like that? Design and things like that? There's certain aspects of the law that says if you're designing things, you have to take safety into account, and there are laws around it. If you're part of the manufacturing process, you need to manufacture the way that designer put that in place so that it's safe. If you're importing stuff, plant, substances or structures, they have to meet the standards of Australia. So you can't just get a machine that doesn't have any guards on it and put it in place. You need to make sure that it is safe. And if you're installing, constructing or commissioning plant or structures, the same sort of deal. So there's lots of rules there, isn't there? And it all comes out of that work health and safety legislation, that act, that regulations. Who's ultimately responsible, do you think, for safety in the workplace? Who's the most responsible person? Yeah, manager. Probably the business owners, because at the end of the day, the manager, well, might be able to do what they can do as far as managing certain aspects of the business, but they've always got a boss, haven't they? They've got the owners, the directors of the business. So they have a very important duty. Their duty as decision makers that affect the whole business, financially influence the business, their duties are paramount to making sure that there's a safe workplace. They have to ensure that the business complies with the law, that it puts in processes for managing risk. So the people at the top have a very strong duty, and their duties are certainly reflective in there, that they check on their managers, make sure their managers are doing the right thing, make sure that the processes in place in the business are working correctly. Workers. So workers are expanded upon. It doesn't matter whether you're a paid employee of that business, you could be a worker. So if you're a contractor doing work, you've been engaged by a company to go and do work at a particular place, you're a worker for that place for that period while you're doing that work. Same with subcontractors. If you're a labour hire worker, so you're working for a host employer, so you work for, I don't know, skilled engineering, and they place you at another workplace, you're classified as a worker. You're a worker at a skilled engineering, but you're also a worker for the place that you're placed at. Apprentices, trainees, work experience students. So have you ever done any work experience or anything like that? Or any volunteering, those sorts of things? You actually get classified as a worker in those cases. So that business, that undertaking that has you volunteering or doing work experience has an obligation to you as a worker. But you have an obligation as a worker to them as well. So it's really important that you know what the rules are, that you're looked after, that you're taken care of. Of course, with all laws, there's penalties. And I guess in Australia, the work health and safety penalties are very extreme. They've categorised them. So if a person conducts recklessly exposes a person to risk or death or serious injury or illness, so reckless, what do you think reckless means to you? What do you think you'd have to do to put a worker at that risk or somebody at risk to be reckless?
Don't give them proper induction.
Yeah, probably a little bit of that. I think you'd have to have knowledge that that risk, that hazard that you're exposing to them to could kill them or really seriously injure them, that you haven't done anything to protect that person. So it could be like working on the side of a multi-storey building on the roof and not giving any fall protection to that person. Just say, go up there and just don't fall over the edge, and that's your instruction to them. Well, that's how it used to be. It still happens now. A boss will say to someone, don't fall over the edge. That's your instruction, send them up there. That's pretty reckless though, isn't it? Because there's a lot of things that can be put in place to make sure that person doesn't fall in this day and age, isn't there? And an instruction like that's not good enough. So reckless is a key thing. The other two categories, really, it's about putting someone at a serious risk or not complying with a duty. Now, the penalties to these laws are very, very massive. Previously in South Australia, a maximum penalty was $300,000 for an employer. Now it's $3 million if you recklessly do something. But generally, most businesses, if they give somebody a piece of machinery, they're not quite certain on it, they haven't assessed it properly, they haven't put in decent controls, such as guarding, such as training, such as maintenance programs, those sorts of things, they're probably more around the category 2. Because some businesses just don't have that knowledge. But if BHP Billiton gave you a machine that wasn't guarded properly, then that would probably be reckless for a big business like that, because they have the resources, the capabilities. So sometimes it comes down to that assessment. Were they capable in making that assessment well enough? As you can see here, some of the penalties talk about jail time. And these are individual penalties. So the business, if it's an individual, like a self-employed person, or if the business, or if they're an officer, like the owners, the directors of a business, they're subject to massive fines now and possible penalties. So if an officer just said, nah, get up there, get on the roof, I don't care what it takes, get the job done, not only would the business be in trouble because it has a duty, but that officer would also be in trouble. But on the switch side, if that business, if that officer provides you with good fall protection, good training, has instructions never to get up on the roof, and you go, blow that, I'm going to get up there anyway to get the ball down, and you go and bypass everything that you're educated in, everything that they put in place, then you as a worker or as an individual could be subject to fairly hefty penalties. What's the worst penalty for an individual though that does that? Worst penalty is not the financial, not the going to the court, that you fall over the edge and you die. You don't get another shot at it, do you, once you do that? So with a lot of workers, when they do put themselves at risk, they end up with those penalties already. They end up with injuries, and that's not a good thing, is it? So risk. Talked about hazard. A hazard being a source or situation that could injure someone. Risk is the possibility that harm, death, injury or illness might occur when you're exposed to that hazard. I always like to say, have a hazard, introduce a human being, there's your risk. So the introduction of a human to that hazard is a risk. But there's other types of risks as well. There's environmental risks, there's property risks, there's all sorts of other risks, financial risks as well. But when we talk about workplace health and safety, we're talking about human beings, not koalas, not the grass, not a piece of equipment being damaged. We're talking about human beings getting damaged. Risk control. I guess that's what we're here to educate you in tonight. Risk management, risk control. Taking action to eliminate those risks. So how could you eliminate somebody falling over the edge of a building? Quite easily. How could you eliminate that? Yeah, probably not eliminating it because the hazard's still there, isn't it?
Always keep them locked with the station wire.
Yeah, that's right. Make sure that they can never get up there. So have a lock on the door, have a process where only skilled, trained, authorised people can get up there. And then you've eliminated that risk for most people. It's still not foolproof. Probably the only foolproof thing, knock down the building, then there's no hazard anymore and then there's no risk, is there? No one can fall off of it, but So it's pretty hard to manage safety, because if you try to eliminate, you can't always. Minimisation is generally where most things occur. Risk management. So you've got a little code of practice. So this code of practice, we've got the Act and the regulations, the law, the must. It tells you must do certain things as a business, as an employer. These codes of practice actually tell you, nice, simplistic form, how to manage those things. So this how to manage work health and safety risks, it details that whole process, and that process is mapped out. So if you look at page 5 of that book, it's got that risk management model there. So it says step 1, steps it out for you. So the first thing that you must do is identify the hazard. So let's go through that. So there's lots of different types of hazards, and we've got a list of a few of them up there. So you've got manual tasks. Why is manual tasks right at the top? Manual handling. What do you think? What do you think that's up there at the top? Because out of all injuries in workplaces, 42% of injuries are related to manual tasks. Manual handling, lifting boxes, moving things, pushing, sustained postures, repetitive tasks, those sorts of things. They injure more people than anything else. Gravity. What's gravity to you? So it's falling things. So you could be walking through a park, windy day, under some trees, some big gum trees. Branch falls down due to gravity, isn't it? And a bit of unluck if you're underneath it. So those businesses that have trees on their workplace, like schools, like universities, they have to assess those trees. They have to determine, are they in a safe condition for all the students that walk around the campus. Council has to try and do that for all the trees in all the parks, things like that. So it's pretty hard to manage. You couldn't eliminate it, could you, unless you cut all the trees down, and that wouldn't be any good for us, would it? Electricity speaks for itself, but it also says ignition sources. So where you've got flammable liquids, flammable things, electricity is an ignition source, so it poses a hazard as far as that's concerned. Chemicals, definitely. Machinery. Machinery does probably the most damage to most people. Machinery and falling from height, people falling off of ladders and off of roofs. That probably kills more people than anything else. Because machinery, it's made to do things that the human being can't do physically. So it takes no prisoners. It chops off fingers, it chops off arms, it drags people in, it kills them. So machinery has to be really appreciated heavily because it does serious damage to people. Extreme temperatures, hazard for sure. If you're working up in one of the mine sites, 54-degree day. That's the sort of extremes that they get. And they're working physically hard, working 12-hour shifts. They have to factor in that as a real hazard to their people. So they have to have really good processes around that. Noise. So at 85 decibels, anything above that over an 8-hour working day is going to damage your hearing. You are going to lose hearing. And in this country, we do not accept anyone losing their hearing because they're at work. Shouldn't happen. So it's a really bad hazard. It's one of those hazards that was probably ignored in the past where people just went, be a man and get through it, but it's not acceptable anymore. And there's standards around it. Radiation, so out in the ultraviolet light, welding, microwaves, those sorts of things. Don't know whether if any of you guys get to play with any of those toys in your studies. Biological. Hospitals. They say they're the most dangerous place to go and visit to and be patients because there's all sorts of biological hazards. Second greatest hazard that is causing injury now, psychosocial hazards. What do you think psychosocial, why do you think that's the second greatest injury rate now?
Stress.
Stress, yeah. So businesses are asking a lot more out of people. It's a very stressful working environment. So if you get a job that you're not stressed, you're loving it, enjoy it, because it's a real hazard. It's sort of, you know, becoming a real strong one. Bullying, harassment, fatigue, all those sorts of things. And of course, with those hazards, it could end up with mental issues as far as injuries that way, or it could end up with an associated injury where you fall asleep at the wheel or something like that. So classifying those hazards can be very important, because some of those hazards may fit into different categories. Like I said, with your hazardous chemicals, there's all sorts of different things. But you introduce an ignition source to some of those chemicals, like electricity, a socket outlet, those sorts of things. You need to factor both of those in. So you need to identify what those hazards are. So what methods of identifying workplace hazards do you reckon there are? What's the most obvious thing for seeing a hazard that we can use? We've all got them. You're all looking at me with them. Your eyes, your ears, your nose, your touch, your smell, your senses. They're the most obvious. And generally they're going to alert you to something. So that's one way to figure out a hazard. What other ways can you identify hazards? Pardon? Yeah, labels, stickers. So there could be something alerting you to that hazard. It could be a report. It could be somebody telling you that something's wrong. It could be an emergency. Someone might trip over something. Might be walking along this floor every day for 20 years without any issue, and one day there's a little crack come up and someone trips on it. Alerts you to that hazard. You mightn't have seen it. So incidents will alert you to those sorts of things as well. So identifying hazards is a legal requirement for all businesses. Businesses must have processes to figure out what their hazards are. If they don't, then they're not meeting what the law is asking them. Why is it important to identify hazards in the workplace or anywhere? What do you think? Why do you want to see those hazards, know that they're there? Pardon?
Protection.
Protection, yeah, definitely. You can fix them. When you know the hazard's there, when it's been identified, you can put in processes for fixing that hazard. If you don't see that hazard, if you don't go out and look and listen to your people, then certainly you're not going to be able to know them all. Because if you're the person running the business, generally you're not the person doing all the work, are you? So it's really important that businesses talk with their workers, have processes for workers to report things, such as hazard reporting, such a simple thing. So you can take surveys of people. You can refer to your statistics, your first aid records, things like that. So if people are getting a lot of dust in their eyes, it's indicating that maybe you've got an area in your business where there's a lot of dust and that being blown around. So it identifies a hazard for you. If you've never worked in that area, you're not going to be able to identify it, are you? Incidents investigated. So you might find other issues while you're investigating things. Documentation. So documentation, stuff like information, going onto websites, reading the paper. Now, who heard about the incident at the Royal Show on Friday the 12th? Yeah? Where the little girl got killed. Yeah, certainly. So if you had a ride the same as that ride, it would alert you to go, well, what's gone wrong there? I better go and have a look at my ride and make sure that never happens on my ride. And so it identifies that maybe there's a potential issue there. Records. So all those records that are available, such as personal records. For some people, putting them into a work situation and you have a look at their disabilities, the things that may restrict them in that, then you have to make the decision sometimes that I'm not going to put that person in that situation because the hazard's too great, the risk is too great to that person. Safety data sheets. So more information about chemicals, about what they're going to do in certain circumstances. Consultation with workers. Talking to your workers. Why do you talk to your workers to identify hazards? Who does the work? The workers. So they're going to be able to tell you what's going to hurt them more than anyone else. So consultations are key, and it's another legislative requirement. So it talks about here, it's a proactive process. So it's not reactive. So you get out there, you have processes so that you can find things. So if you're importing a piece of machinery, you get a manual with that machine, it's going to tell you what the hazards are. When you see the operation of that machine, you're going to be able to see, oh, actually in our environment, this is going to create a hazard because that machine moves around in a certain way that maybe your environment's not good. So you've got to look at your physical work environment, your machinery, your substances, your work tasks. You've got to look at your management systems and procedures. So your policies, your procedures, your risk assessments, you've got to look at all those sorts of things. Are they effectively creating other hazards? So what's the hazard in that photo? What do you reckon? Fire, yeah. It's just going to burn someone, isn't it? But it could do other things. House fire. Someone gets caught in a house fire. They don't usually burn to death. What gets them? Smoke, yeah. So the smoke takes away your ability to breathe that air that you need to keep alive. What about the second photo there? Asbestos. So asbestos is one of those things. It's a substance that is fibrous in its nature. So when you see asbestos, if you've got asbestos in your building, generally it's pretty safe. It might be contained in some wall sheeting. So when it's contained in that wall sheeting, it's not going to hurt you. You can't breathe it in, can you? But if you break that down, you drill into that wall, you turn it into a dust, then it can get down into your lungs. And that's where asbestos kills people. The trouble is it takes 15, 20, 30 years to kill those people from the associated cancers and things like that it causes. What about that one? What's the hazard there? Lifting? So manual handling, manual tasks. What about that one? Stress, psychosocial, getting yelled at, getting chastised by somebody. What about that one there? Yep, electricity. Machine, yeah. Belts and pulleys. Fall from height. What about there? 5 hazards at sea. What's 5 hazards there that you can see? Just yell them out. Fall from height, yeah. He's working up on that little thin plank, and if he falls, he's going to be hurt, potentially. What else? Pardon? Temperature, yeah. So remember those UV rays, you know, he's got no sun protection, could end up with skin cancer. Pardon? Yeah. What about people walking below? There's no one, you could just walk underneath there and he could fall down on top of you or drop his pail of paint or whatever. You got chemicals there, he could have mixed that paint with thinners and things like that. No safety tools, no. A car could drive through there, so there's no traffic management. So there's lots of different hazards in that scenario, isn't there? I've seen it a few times. I've seen it on Green Hill Road. There was a bloke standing up there. Below him there was big, massive rocks, moss rocks. And he couldn't see the problem when I stopped him from doing that activity. I said, you can't do it this way. So how would you manage that? You've identified all those hazards. How would you get around that? Yeah, well, inspections, you've done your inspection, you've seen it. I guess the next step is to control it, is to figure out, well, how do I make this gentleman's life safety? So you assess those risks. You have a look at the hazards and you go, how can we manage those risks? What can we do? So you assess them all. Simple as that. So that's that step 2 of that process. Work out how severe the harm could be. What was the worst harm there that could happen to that gentleman? Falling down, yeah, without a doubt. So there's no point giving him some protective hat and sunscreen realistically straight off the bat. Yeah, that might help him and he might develop cancer over time, but that falling down hazard's the thing that you want to focus on first. So that's what assessment is about. It's about going how severe the harm could be, estimate the severity of the harm you should consider, what type of harm could occur, and in that scenario there's quite a few types of harm that could occur, but you've got to focus on that main one. What factors could influence the severity of harm that occurs? How many people are exposed to that hazard? So if multiple people are exposed to that hazard, then it's going to be a far more serious issue, isn't it? And could one failure lead to other failures? So here, has anyone done risk assessment before? Yeah, a couple of times. Gave you a bit of it's just an example sheet of, it's called a job safety analysis. It's what a lot of contractors use in this day and age to, one, identify hazards when they see them in the workplace, but also how to assess them and control them. So in that, it talks about those certain things. Likelihood. Is it certain to occur? Is it very likely? Is it possible? Is it unlikely? Is it rare? So it allows you to work out how severe that hazard would be, how severe that risk would be, based on could it occur. Then it gives you a bit of a scorecard. So it looks at consequence versus probability. So could something occur? Is it almost certain? So if you walk down these steps every day and they're all damaged and loose, and you're walking down them once a day every day, it's almost certain that at some stage you could potentially trip. Yeah? So you'd probably say almost certain. What could be the damage that you would sustain if you tripped down the stairs? Would it be catastrophic? So could you be killed? Could you suffer a serious injury? Could you have a major injury, minor injury, or is it negligible that you would just walk away? What do you think? Now, in a room full of people, you're going to get all different answers to that. Some people will say, I'll be catastrophic, I'll end up getting killed. Realistically, that's probably an overreaction, isn't it? So with risk assessment, it's really important that you get people that are doing the job, people that can make that assumption together. So it shouldn't just be the officer of the business that's never done the job before, never looked at the piece of equipment. It should be done by the people that are operating that machinery, with the supervisors and people like that. So risk assessment's about getting the right key people. It should never really be done just by one person. It should be done by a group of people. So really the assessment coming down here, if those steps were damaged, my assessment would be, well, it's probably likely to almost certain that something could happen. And realistically, if you're a fairly youngish sort of person, the damage might be minor. So you've got a high risk, high score of risk, which isn't a good thing. But if it was in an old folks' home and they were coming down those stairs, well, you'd probably get a potential major or critical injury, couldn't you? So sometimes it's based on the people as well and the skills and things like that those people have. So it is very much to the workplace, to the ability of the people there, to the environment that they're in. Now the law says nothing about you having to do risk assessment in those words unless you're in a confined space or in a particular industry such as mining. But the law does say that you must do things reasonably practicable, that you must manage your risk by either eliminating them or minimising them. So it's saying that you must assess those risks. You must identify them, assess them, and then control them. So really the law does say that you have to do risk assessment. But you don't have to always formalise it. You don't have to formalise it if the law says you must do something. So if the law says you must make sure all your machinery is below 85 decibels for your workers using it, you don't need to do an assessment, do you? Because you've already got that standard that you have to meet. So that standard's really important. If a code of practice tells you for managing that risk, do this or this, doing one of those things, you don't have to formalise anything. Just skip ahead and do one of those things. Because the code of practice is reflecting what the law wants you to do anyway. It's just making it in more simplistic terms so that you can understand it. If there are well-known effective controls that are in place within your particular industry, then you don't have to go through that formal risk assessment process. You just get on and put those controls in place because they're already effective in that environment, in that industry. So you already know they're going to work. So you don't need to formalise it too much there. The way I see it is somebody can receive a fairly significant injury. The hazard is of that ilk that it could potentially hurt someone significantly. I'd always document it anyway to show that you've given it the red hot go to try and manage that risk as best you can. Because not everything is guaranteed. If you can't eliminate it, you're minimising it, the hazard still remains, doesn't it? There's still a potential that someone could be injured by that hazard, by that source, that situation, that activity. So in those terms, really documented something is pretty important because then it shows the evidence of what you've done, that you've tried to take those reasonable steps. So, man standing on the side of the roof. Assess the risks. What's the risk to that man standing on the side of the roof? We've identified he could fall off. The environment could potentially hurt him. Could get sunburnt. The person using the saw here. Assess the risk there. Would you say this person's very well educated in using a saw? Not in that circumstance when they got their thumb like that. Can you guard a saw totally? No, you can't. Saw has to cut material, doesn't it? You can't guard all saws. So in the construction industry, they have to assess those risks. Some of their controls aren't going to be a guard to stop someone coming in contact with that saw. The old bloke here that's up on the roof, that might be a one-off job. Doing an assessment, making sure that the person can do it safely, sometimes that's what you have to do to get the job done, isn't it? But realistically, on the side of the roof there, you shouldn't be there. People see things differently. What can you see? Who can see a duck? Hands up? Yeah, a couple. Who can see a rabbit? Who can't see either? Generally, it comes back to education, doesn't it? When you see a picture like this, there's lots of these sorts of things on in there. If somebody comes and educates you and says, oh, actually, does that look like a beak and an eye and a bit of a head? And then people go, oh, yeah, I've seen the duck now. And vice versa. You might go, oh, it's like some ears and an eye, a little bit of a mouth there. There's a little bunny rabbit. People go, oh, yeah, I can see that now. Every time, usually when I'm educating, there's still a few people that say, oh, I can't see either. And it's like, oh, I've got to give up then, don't I? But perception is very important when you're talking about risk assessment. Because if your boss is saying, we got to get the job done, we need to make the money, I don't care about those risks, is that risk assessment going to be successful to dealing with those risks effectively? No. So you need to have that group of people involved in it. It's really important. Those experts, those people that are going to do the job. So step 3, controlling the risks. So what do you think controlling the risks means? Minimise them, yeah. Putting things in place so that that risk to that person is as low as reasonable. So as low as reasonable to me, in my view, no one gets hurt. Is that fair enough in a workplace? Yeah. So that's what you're aiming to do. Controlling the risk so no one gets hurt. Do you think it's really successful right across the world as far as workplace safety, that they control all risks, stop us all getting injured? Nah. 42% of all injuries, manual handling related. So where people have to physically do things, you can't control them that effectively, can you? You can do controls though. What the law says is that when you are controlling risks, you can't just train someone. You can't just put a policy in place. You need to do that assessment. You need to work out how dangerous that is. It says that it wants you to aim to eliminate those hazards, which we know you can't always do. But then it says there's a second level there, that you must substitute that hazard that you've found for a safer one. So can anyone think of a hazard that you could substitute? Swap over? Chemicals are usually a good example, or a piece of machinery. So you might have a 20-year-old drill. You go and get a brand new drill with all the new safety mod cons. You've substituted that old hazardous drill for something that's a bit safer. Still a drill, still has risks to it, but you have substituted it for something that's safer. So that's one of your good steps. A chemical. Chemicals with modern technology, they make them safer all the time. So if that chemical can do the same job that the chemical that you've been using all the time, then go for the safer one. So substitute it. Isolating the hazard from people. So when we go back to machinery, maybe even to the point that we talk about one of these stairs being damaged, how can you isolate people from that hazard? Barriers, things like that. So physical barriers to stop people getting to things. So you look at construction workers, you look at council workers, they put up that big orange mesh bunting and they all stand behind it in the dangerous area where the hazards are. Who are they keeping out of that area? They're keeping out people that don't have that education, don't have that knowledge about those hazards and risks, don't have the training. So they isolate all the people that shouldn't be in that area from going in there. With a machine with moving parts, the isolation process is that physical guard. Reducing the risk through engineering controls. So what's an engineering control? So something that's generally mechanical in nature. So when you see somebody walking down the street and they've got a trolley and they've got their boxes of whatever it is on that trolley, that's an engineering control. It's not totally eliminating the manual task at hand, but it's making it easier. Forklifts, trucks, they're all engineering controls. Things such as light curtains, things such as robots and that, they're all engineering controls to deal with a hazard. They're not totally going to stop it from occurring, but they are a very high level. They don't rely so much on the human being. The other levels of control, administrative controls. So policies, procedures, training, information. So with that, those controls, generally they're the ones that you'll see more often than not. Remember, when you're doing your identification, you're doing your assessment, you've got to factor in how potentially harmful that hazard may be to a person. So if you just slap, oh, we'll train the person not to get on the roof, or we'll train the person, to put their hand in the machine in between its cycles, it's going to lead to failure. It's not good enough. So training and education and policies and procedures in those circumstances with a machine versus a guard, so the person can't put their hand in there, or a guard that has an interlock and engineering control, so when the guard's lifted the machine shuts off and there's no moving parts, that's a far more successful result, and that person will go away in a better condition rather than the person putting their hand in there. Who here believes in common sense? Persons shouldn't stick their hand in a machine, should they? Shouldn't, should you? That's common sense. But so many people put their hands in a machine because common sense fails in a business environment. Because when you walk in a room, to you, you're really the only one with common sense. For me, I'm the only one with common sense as far as my environment, because it's come through my education, through my upbringing, through my training and that. You can get your workers to have common sense, but it takes a lot of work, a lot of training, a lot of education, a lot of reviewing, a lot of re-education, those sorts of things around using a machine, not putting your hand in there. But it can lead to so many failures, and it is not, as per the law saying, effective enough. So the law says you must either eliminate them or minimise them by doing something in level 2. You cannot start level 3 until you've absolutely assessed level 2 that you can do things. So isolation, substitution or engineering. You must focus on one of those. But when you get down to your administrative controls, training, education, people need to readily understand it. And also personal protective equipment can be used as well. So what's personal protective equipment? What do you think? Earmuffs, earplugs, high visibility clothing, gloves, glasses, respirators, full body suits, breathing apparatus, all those sorts of things. Safety shoes. So they're all personal protective equipment. But personal protective equipment doesn't manage the hazard, does it? It manages the human being's exposure to the hazard. So it is the lowest form of protection. It is the lowest control. And that's why that control can never be put up first. It has to be engineering, substitution or isolation first. Then your policies and procedures. Then your personal protective equipment. So that little code of practice that I gave you details all that information in there. Talks about all that sort of stuff. Talks about elimination or substitution. So total removal of the hazard from the workplace. Or contract out the task. So businesses did that a lot under the old occupational health and safety. They go, oh, that's too risky for our business. We'll just get someone else in to do it, and they'd handball it to them. Still didn't get rid of the risk. Under the new law, that can't be acceptable anymore. You can't just pass that risk on to someone else, because that risk is part of your obligation to manage that. So now you have to work together with those people, those contractors that will do your work. So you can't just handball that off anymore. And that's a good thing. Substituting existing equipment, substances for something less hazardous, basically. Engineering, modifying, redesigning processes for the objective of reducing risk. Use of ventilation to remove chemical fumes or dust. Use of lifting aids to minimise manual handling. Guarding to enclose. Isolation involves limiting or preventing access to the hazard through installing a barrier. Administration is that work procedures. job rotation is an administrative process. So if you're working outside a lot, one of the ways to control that exposure to the sun, to the heat, to that environment is that you rotate that job through other people, and that's a fairly acceptable management of it, so that the exposure's not as much, so you're not going to be affected by that heat, by that fatiguing factor. Limiting the numbers of workers exposed. So instead of having a process operating right in the middle of your whole workplace that affects all your workers, moving that process somewhere else so it only affects a couple, so less people are exposed. Permit to work systems. So no one's allowed to do this particular work until they get your permission. Why is that important? Why is that a good control? Because if you can't do the task unless you've got a permit, then that person can actually check and balance that you've got good safety things in place to do that job safe. So a permit to work is really important. Generally it's around confined spaces. So if you had to go into a big winery tank, then you can't go in there until that business gives you the permit to go in there, because there's certain processes that have to be met to go into that tank. You go inside of a tank, something goes wrong, you're dead. That's how serious confined space is. So when you go around and you see confined space entry, permits required and that's because if someone went into that area that's confined, they could be killed. So it's really important that those things are followed. So that's an administrative control. It's relying on a lot of things under administration, because sometimes you can't engineer, you can't isolate, you can't substitute, you can't eliminate. Sometimes people still have to get into some of those situations. But the level of controls to have that person go in there are very extensive. So there's training, there's education, there's that permit in the first place. There's job safety analysis, so there's risk assessments all done. There's procedures around it. And that's not only for the person going into that confined space, because there has to be a secondary person that's there guarding that confined space, so if something goes wrong in there, they can get them out. So it could be a rope around somebody's waist. It could be an emergency situation. It's really high level, yeah?
Someone got permission, for example, to go into the tank.
Yep.
And something went wrong. So what is responsible for that?
Well, if something went wrong, then there should be emergency processes so that if you collapsed, that you can be pulled out of there. So the whole process is that extensive that if something was to go wrong, the person shouldn't die in there. They should be able to be brought out in an emergency. But if the business, yeah, definitely. Unless you've chosen to go and bypass all the things that you're educated and just gone, oh, bugger it, I'm going to get in there anyway, then that business is totally responsible. So the managers of that business, they are responsible as well. But they are classified as workers. They're not classified as officers. So they have an obligation to make sure that those systems, those procedures, those permits are working, are being adhered to, are being supervised. Training of staff that are exposed, definitely. You can't go into a confined space unless you've had confined space entry training. You can't be the person that's associated with confined space entry guarding the person that's going in there unless you've had confined space entry training. Training is very important. Why is training important? Come on, you're the experts at training. You're here getting trained.
Getting the staff ready for the school.
Pardon?
Getting the staff ready for the school.
Yeah, so they understand what they have to do. Yeah, minimising the risk, definitely. It's also productive, isn't it? When you train your staff how to do something safely, productively, they do it better, don't they? If you just let them do it their own way, They might all have different ideas on how to do it. And when people have different ideas on how to do it and they're allowed to do it different ways, risk goes up. Risk that things can be damaged, human beings can be hurt, productivity actually then starts going backwards. So risk management is very important for productivity. It's not put in the way as being a blocker to being productive. Because a business that is safe is always productive as well. Because at the end of the day, they don't have to pull someone out of a machine when they're being damaged. They don't have to suffer all the costs of an injury, things like that. So safety is very important that way. Supervision, signage, reports, JSAs, safe operating procedures, they're all administrative controls. And the personal protective, we just talked about a few of those. So controls. So when you're looking at controlling something, you've gone and you had a look at this hazard, you've seen it, you've assessed it, you've gone, oh, we've got to do something about this because someone could be hurt. Then you control it. You don't just think it up yourself. There is a lot of good information out there from your workers. There's a lot of good information from codes of practice, Australian standards, the work health and safety legislation. So it's not as if you have to try and figure it out yourself. The manufacturer of a machine, when they provide you the manuals, that manual gives you a lot of information that you can control risks. As far as codes of practice, they're all free. They're freely available, and you get them from Safe Work SA, from their website, or you get them from Safe Work Australia. The work health and safety legislation, all totally free from those websites. So there's no excuse why people can't have it. With an Australian standard, they're restrictive. They cost a lot of money. They're more difficult. There's other material that you can get. You can get industry guidance notes. You can get lots of different guidance material. And generally, if you go to the Safe Work SA website, you type in what you're looking for. Or if you go into Safe Work Australia's website, type in what you're looking for, you're going to find a lot of information that way. Use the old Google, that's pretty good. Manufacturers' instructions, safety data sheets, they are going to give you information on how to control risks. So here's some examples. So elimination, automate the manual tasks, such as using remote controls, so that a human being doesn't have to physically do anything. Deliver goods directly to the point of use to eliminate multiple handling. Someone's still handling it, but if you simplify the task, then you may eliminate some of the hazards to certain people. Substitution, replace heavy items with those that are lighter, smaller or easier to handle. I used to be a storeman many moons ago, and we used to live 40 kilo, even the odd 50 kilo box and bag and things like that, which they don't have too much anymore. Agriculture, yeah, they've still got a bit to go, unfortunately, but certainly that is one of the controls. Replacing those heavy items for a small item, so it's easier to handle. It's going to be less manually taxing. Replace hand tools with power tools, so there's not those forces that you have to put through those hand tools, so that it is easier. A machine's doing a lot of that for you. Isolating vibrating machinery from the user, so having independent seating on mobile plant, having all the seating examined ergonomically, put in place, really important. Engineering, using mechanical lifting aids. So cranes and hoists and things like that are definitely a good control, aren't they? Rather than having 4 people trying to lift a 200 kilo thing together, you have a hoist. Chain it up, use slings. Still a hazard, still heavy, but people aren't going to break their backs doing it. There's going to be other hazards that you have to deal with though. Provide workstations that are height adjustable. Why is that important? Because when you're 6'3" tall, it's important, guarantee you. Because when you get a chair and a desk and it's built for someone about that tall and I have to go and sit at it, it's pretty hard work. hop in a little car, much more difficult. So ergonomics is very important. Administrative, we talked about a few of those. So what would be a control that you would put in place to make sure that that person is doing the right thing? What do you reckon? What could you do to make sure that that person's safe when they're using that saw? Let's go back to our list of... Could we eliminate that? Yeah. So you could have someone else pre-cutting it all for you. So you buy your materials cut to size. That would be very costly though, wouldn't it? So you'd be paying a premium for that. So you could eliminate it, but probably the cost would be disproportionate to doing it yourself. Could you substitute it? Use a different saw, maybe one with a bit better guarding, potentially. But still a saw needs to cut that timber. Isolate. Can you isolate the user? No, somebody has to use it, don't they? Engineering. What could you do? Can't put a light curtain there because as soon as the timber hits the light curtain, it's going to stop the machine. So really you can't focus on that. So you can't, but as long as you think through that process, can I eliminate it? Can I substitute it? Can I isolate it? Can I engineer it? And you look at all the reasonable things that can be done around each of those. If there's something that's reasonable, you do it. If there's not, well, at least you've assessed it. Administrative. What could you do to that person so that they don't put their thumb like that under a saw? What do you reckon? Wear gloves? Ooh, maybe not. So moving parts, spinning, fast spinning, gloves aren't good, they get caught in them. But I like your thought process. Yeah, you could have a Kevlar glove or something like that. Pardon? Training. Supervision, very good. And what else? So what would you train them in? Procedures. So you might have a policy or a procedure. Yeah. So that with that supervision, with the training, with the policy and procedure, then that person then may never stick their thumb under that saw blade. May. It's not guaranteed. And that's why when an injury like that occurs, if that person is competent, been doing a lot of years, they're educated, trained, they go through a trade, they have a safe operating procedure for using it, then realistically if they cut their thumb off, that no one's going to be held accountable because everything that's reasonable has been done in most cases. Generally, not too many people cut their whole thumb off. They usually feel it before they get right through. Trust me. I've not done it myself. What about this person here? What could you do? What would be the controls to that person in managing that? Can you eliminate that person being up on the roof? It's pretty hard to tell what he's there for. Possibly. So you could change whatever process it is to another location so that you can do it from the ground. So there may be a potential to eliminate. So when you're thinking through those processes, you're doing those assessments, you're figuring out those controls, and you are going through that hierarchy, you're doing what the law is asking you to do. So the hierarchy of controls is the key. Substitute. Could you substitute it? Possibly not. Maybe you could get a younger, fitter human being up there. Still the same risk. Isolation. Yeah, you could isolate that person so that they can't get up there at all. Or, what else could you do? Use engineering. Put barriers in place. So what could you put on the side of that roof? You could put hand railing up there. What other mechanical aid could you use for that person to do that task? You'd use a beam lift, cherry picker, those sorts of things as well potentially. So there could be a lot of good things that you could do at that higher level. What was that? Mattress? Oh, probably not. Not a stunt man. No, you probably wouldn't get away with that one. But certainly you could use a lot of isolation or engineering controls so someone wouldn't be put at risk there. So see how you can use that hierarchy, you can step through those processes and you can work out what is reasonable to be done. Of course then if that person's going up there and you've got some fall protection, you may have some training as well. The training might be, you know, stick to the pathway. You may do a job safety analysis that details what the task is and how it should be done, those sorts of things. Unfortunately, with working at heights, you'll see workers on single level story construction sites all the time, walking along thin timber frames. And so some of that does get back to that administrative, that training and that supervision and things like that, that competency. But there's a lot of other things that go alongside that. They don't let people stand on the side of a roof without being competent, but they've also got to assess, well, if they do fall, what's below them? And so if there's rebar there, so you're reinforcing bars sticking out of the ground, you're not going to have someone standing up here with all that there, because if they do fall, you know, they're going to be a shish kebab, aren't they? They're going to get skewered, and that's not a good thing. So they have to look at those multiple things when you're assessing risks. I mean, level 4, personal protective equipment, you probably, the gloves, I like the thought process, but with gloves, they're very, very good control for certain things like hot stuff and sun exposure and things like that. But for moving parts, they can be quite often worse. Clothing and things like that will drag you in entrapment points. Most important step, so you've controlled your risks. Check the time. You've put them in place. You've got to make sure they're effective. The law says that when you're controlling a hazard, it has to be effective. So how do you think you would go about that? Making sure that something's effective, that it's working. Pardon? Yeah. So observing people, demonstrations, making sure that what you've planned, because this is all about planning, isn't it? It's planning somebody to do something and do it safely, that it's actually working. So actually observing, keeping an eye on it, supervising people, making sure that, well, actually there's some other issues here, and adapting them as you go. That's one way. Talking to your workers is definitely another one. So surveying the workers, reviewing incident reports. So sometimes you might go 12 months and you review, oh, we've had 3 incidents there in that particular area. Are we actually controlling that area as effectively as what we should? And that would open up that maybe you're not being effective, you're not controlling those risks well. When you're performing risk management, it is all about trying to get it 100% right. And what's 100% right? When do you know that you've succeeded totally? No one gets hurt, and you're still productive. You're still making money. I always throw that one in there, because there's no point making something as safe as it can be and sending your business broke. So if you do that, you're not going to last too long. There's no point being the safest workplace in the world. You also have to be a very productive workplace as well. So it goes hand in hand, safety and productivity. But the success will always be measured by no one having a near miss, no one receiving an injury. You're being productive. And you're certainly going to get a lot of stats through your business. Your first aiders are going to tell you a lot of things, aren't they? Have people gone to the first aid person and got a lot of dust in their eyes because you've got them working in an area where it's dusty, and you didn't give them goggles, you didn't give them eye protection, or you didn't make sure that you were having a good clean of that floor area so that there wasn't dust particles everywhere, or you didn't put in screening so that wind wouldn't blow that dust up, whatever it might be. So if you're getting injuries, if you're getting first aid things, they're going to tell you some things. The law says you must review, you must monitor what you put in place though. So when you're building something, when you're putting your controls in place, one of your controls is always going to be administrative, and that's going to be a method of reviewing something. So when you look at incident reports, first aid records, registers of things happening, they're all very good tools to show you, are you actually achieving what you're trying to do there? Are you actually making sure people are safe? Has it introduced a new type of hazard? Because you might go, rightio, we'll put brand new beautiful steps in here, and you do it. You put brand new beautiful steps, and the first 3 times people come in here, they trip over them because they're brand new, they're beautiful, but they're a little bit higher than the last ones were, and people aren't used to that. So have you introduced another hazard? Potentially you have. So how would you control that hazard? You may educate people. We've got new steps. Can you just be careful coming down the stairs until people get used to them? Nice simple measure, isn't it? You might highlight them with yellow. You might put some slip resistance. You might go, actually, somebody's tripped over them. We're not happy with them. You might assess them and go, we're not real happy with them. And you might go, no, let's rip them out. Put the old ones back in there because they're far less dangerous to us. So you've got to work out, are you introducing a new hazard? Is the control doing what you planned it to do? Are people wearing it? Are people following it? Supervision's really important. And under this work health and safety law, supervisors play a massive part. So if you get a promotion to be a supervisor, your job is really to coach and mentor all those people in following the policies and procedures of that business for doing what they're educated to do. So it's a really important role, supervisor. And it's quite often one of the ones that fails that leads to an incident, leads to somebody not doing the right thing. Because the supervisor might have got promoted from the shop floor, might be mates with some of the workers there, see some things, doesn't coach and mentor those people into doing it right. Then someone gets hurt. Does it comply with the legislation? So when you're looking at law, it's a standard, and that standard must be met as far as law is concerned. So if the standard says, and I'll pick on noise because it's a pretty easy one to set, that it sets a standard of 85 decibels over an 8-hour period. So if you're subjecting a worker to 90 decibels over that 8-hour period and you've not got ear protection, you don't have job rotations, they're getting that full exposure to that 90 decibels, then you are actually injuring that person as a business. So it's your responsibility to put things in place to cut that down through that hierarchy of controls. How would you review and monitor if you did have a job rotation? How would you work out that that's working in that environment? You want to see a report. You want to have some sort of level of sign in, sign out to that area potentially. Because if that's your control to get that exposure down to maybe only 4 hours a day, so it doesn't injure people's hearing, you want to make sure that that's working. So reviewing and evaluating and monitoring is really important. Because if your control's administrative, then things can go wrong more than those other controls. Does it comply with legislation? So if it's 90 decibels over an 8-hour period and you've got that person working there, then your control is not effective. If the law changes, you have to be up with those changes in the law. So if the law changes and suddenly says, oh, actually at 83 decibels now, that's the new law, you need to then change with that law. Because they're saying at that, it's going to injure you. But if your workers work 12 hours a day and they're working in 85 decibels, that's not meeting the legislative requirement either, because that legislative requirement's over an 8-hour working day. you put them into that exposure over a 12-hour day, you're actually exposing them to 85 over 12 hours, which will damage their hearing. So there's codes of practice that explain all this stuff, make it simple for people to understand it. So there's a chart for whatever level noise you have. So you could actually be at 81 decibels below what the exposure standard is, but if you're working 12-hour shift, you're actually at that limit as well. So it's important to look at that, look at what the law says. Do we need to apply something different? That's the question you've got to ask. Is it working? Do we need to put something else in place? Do we need to put some other little bits and pieces in? Do we need to get everyone back in and re-educate them, retrain them? Do we need to survey people? Is it working? Inspections are good, but they're only as good as the people doing the inspections. So when you have inspections, people need to be understanding of what their role is. So when you're using that as a survey, as a monitoring device, then that person, you don't want them just going along and going, yeah, everything's all right, and going out and having a quick smoke, because that ain't going to work, is it? That person is integral to make sure that they check all those things on that list. So you need to make sure that those people are educated in using that, and you need to monitor that as well. Surveys are very good for figuring out, are employees able to do the job that you've designed them to do? Because remember, when you do hazard management, risk management, you've actually designed something that you think is going to work. So surveying the people that are doing that task, operating that machinery, sometimes they'll be able to tell you, well, actually this isn't working the way that we thought it would. Talking to your people is so important. The law wants businesses to talk to their workers. The law says that they must be talked to. So the Act and the regulation, they spell out the word must. So if it's in there, it must be done. So the law says a business must identify all reasonably foreseeable hazards. So you need to go out and look at all your hazards, figure out what they are, and put controls in place. It says that a business must manage their hazards by either eliminating or minimising them. And we've gone through that. Then it says a business must review and monitor. So that's a whole risk management process reflected in law. The law says it must be done. So there's no excuse for a business not doing it, because if they don't do it, then they're not going to have that safe work environment. But if they do, if they identify their hazards, they assess them, they control them with reasonable steps, then realistically those first three steps, they've made sure that people aren't going to be exposed to hazards that potentially are going to hurt them. It's not guaranteed though, because you could have somebody and you could have a trolley, you could have some boxes that they have to lift every day. We're all human beings. We'll have different braking strains, don't we? So with manual handling, that's why 42% of all injuries are manual handling related, because human beings break down. And we're all different sizes and abilities, and we do play sport, and we have properties, and we do lots of work outside of the work hours that affect our body as well. So we'll never be able to totally get rid of that. Effectiveness. So you've got to look at the level of physical and psychological comfort of the hazard control for users. So there's no point putting something in place that actually makes the job that much more difficult, that it creates that hazard of a psychological issue. People get stressed, people get fatigued, upset, productivity gets hit, and it hurts productivity, and that's going to cause all sorts of stress, because suddenly if productivity starts declining because you've made it the safest thing in the world, what does that do to the business? So if you're the safest business but you're not the productive business that you need to be, what happens to your business? You lose money. And when you lose money, what happens to people's jobs? Yeah, they lose their job, and that's the ultimate stress, isn't it? You go to job for what? Why do people go to work? There's only one answer to that. Money. Cool. Unless you're a multi-millionaire and you're bored. And there's not too many of them around, is there? So that's why we go to work. That's why workers go to workplaces, to earn money for their family, for their social being, for having a good life. And that's the only reason. So when people go to work for that money, do they want to get home safely? Yeah, definitely. So when you look at that, safety is paramount. When people are quizzed about what's the most important thing to them at work, safety usually ranks number one, not money. Because when you go to work and you're working, the money gets taken care of. You work 8 hours, you're going to get paid for 8 hours. But you don't want to be working for 8 hours using an unsafe machine or having big trucks drive straight past you that you make one mistake or they make one mistake and you get killed. That's not why you go to work. You go to work to earn that money so you can enjoy life. And that's why safety is so important. That's why reviewing and monitoring is so important, because the only way that you know you're going to be effective is somebody's actually making sure that everything's working the way that it's designed to work. And so your supervisors, your managers, your workers, your training people, they're all very important. You need to ensure that the level of safety provided by controls is appropriate for the people and the circumstances. So no point putting a control in place that people don't understand. So if somebody's, maybe has a disability and they're vision impaired, there's no point putting a control in place like a barrier that they can't see that they're going to trip over, is there? You'd have to do something a bit better than that. So your barrier might be something a lot higher that if they, and you may have to have that administrative stuff where you explain to them that there is a barrier there and all those other things. Yeah. So some of those things are really important. You might have a alarm. So when they step into that area, the alarm tells them you can't proceed. All those sorts of things. Need to look at reliability. Check that you have selected your control mechanism in a way that it is demonstrably linked to the hierarchy of controls. You have to link that hierarchy of controls. If you don't focus on that, you're not meeting what the law says. That's really important. That so many businesses don't understand the hierarchy of controls. So use those little books. Those little books just help you guide through all the risk assessment, risk management process. Assess the benefits of the control mechanism you are putting in place. What is the likely impact on productivity? You always have to factor in productivity. Like I keep saying, you can be the safest workplace, but if you go broke, that doesn't do anyone any favours. So you've always got to think, is it going to really hurt us productivity-wise? What is the likely impact on organisational performance? What is the likely impact on individuals or team performance? How will the benefits of the control be monitored? So you've got to ask a lot of questions, don't you? Costs. You need to consider the following. Costs of equipment or materials, the cost of installation, cost of delays in production, the cost of time to train users and operators, costs of supervisors, costs of having a system that you have to have lots more monitoring, lots more checklists. And so sometimes that $50,000 cost for something that's engineered or a barrier, an isolation or a substitution, a new machine, sometimes the cost of that is going to be far less than the cost of making sure people are trained, supervised, monitored all the time. So sometimes you have to weigh that up as well. And that's why that hierarchy is spelled out the way it is. So, if you rely on training, toughest cat in the world, that one. But geez, those dogs would have to be pretty well trained for that cat to do that, wouldn't they? Only takes one of them to go stuff it. I want to eat that cat today, and the rest will just follow, won't they? If you know dogs. And personal protective equipment, probably not the best thing all the time. So in summary, risk management, it's a legal requirement in Australia. Your businesses have to identify all hazards. They must assess and manage them through elimination or minimisation. They must also control those hazards by using the hierarchy of controls. And lastly, they have to review and monitor that everything's being effective the way it should be. If you're doing all that, you're spending the time to do it, less injuries, guaranteed. Businesses that use good risk management processes have less injuries, saves them a lot of money. Because at the end of the day, an injury, you have to replace that person, you have to re-educate someone to fill that position, you have to deal with the trauma of having that person out of your workplace. It might be one of your mates, one of your friends. You may have to face the trauma of being investigated by the regulator as far as that's concerned as well. Risk management makes businesses more productive. Why? Because when you're using that risk management process, you are planning to do that job safely and productively at the same time. So you have to implement them when you're required by the law, which it said, when you're changing work practices, when you're doing something different. Why is it important to identify hazards and assess them and control them at that stage when you change something? Because you introduce potentially more hazards. And it could just be down to changing the education of those people. Purchasing new equipment. Well, it's new. New substances. They're things that you haven't used before. So you need to assess the impact on them and put controls in place. New information about workplace risks become available, like that scenario with that show ride. If you have the same show ride and you're going around the world with that show ride, you're going to have to reassess that show ride because it's killed somebody. Responding to workplace incidents, even if no injury has occurred. Because where there's an incident, it's confirming that that hazard potentially could have injured someone, even if it didn't. So it's confirmation that that hazard is a risk to people. So I think I'll wrap it up there a little bit. Now, I've left that job safety analysis with you guys. That's just an example of some of the risk management processes built into a tool. And you'll see many different risk assessment tools. Some will be process driven, or be about processes, and generally those job safety analysis are about processes. But they rely on that person to, one, have a look at the task that's going to be undertaken, the environment that that task is going to be undertaken in, and come up with the controls to best do it. And it has those assessment tools like risk matrix, so that you can go, well, this is what we think the outcome could be if we don't put in reasonable controls. And then when you put the controls in place, then it asks you to reassess them. With those controls in place, is it going to be safer than what it was before? And that's the process that's quite good in those tools. Having a hazard register is another thing that you can have in place. That then shows you that you, one, have identified the hazard, two, that you've put in the actions to control that hazard. So it's a good way of monitoring those hazards as well, to make sure that you're keeping an eye on them. It could put review dates. So all these little tools help. As far as an Australian standard, there is a work health or occupational health and safety, it's called management system model. And really that talks about an OHS policy, a commitment being in place by a business. And that's really important, because if a business isn't committed to safety, do you think they're going to be a safe business? No, they're not. So in that Australian standard, it looks at having a commitment through your policy, and then putting in things such as planning, doing risk assessments, having tools to I guess, detail what your hazards are and how you're going to go about fixing them. Implementation, putting those controls in place, putting things like supervisors training, machinery guarded, those sorts of things. And then measurement and evaluation, are they being effective? And then management review. It's called the continuous improvement model. Any questions? What do you think? You could go out and do a risk assessment? Pretty hard. Pretty hard to teach how to do a risk assessment in 2 hours realistically. But when you get out to the workforce, when you're doing whatever you're doing, those risk management processes are important. And I think as a worker, when you're first starting out as a worker, when your business says, here's our policies, here's our procedures, the most important thing that you can do is follow those policies and procedures. They're written with your safety as the intent, so that you go home safely. If you get into your management positions, if you're running a business, then you can see that it is a legislative requirement for businesses to have these processes in place. So you need to make sure that the business is doing this, because if you're not compliant to the law. But most importantly, you're probably not going to have a safe workplace, and people could potentially get hurt. Even in an office environment, there's hazards, isn't there? So there has to be a level of risk management. But the level of risk management in an office is going to be far less than in a construction site, on a university campus, in a mine, on a ship out at sea, because the hazards there, you know, something goes wrong in some of those places, people could be killed. Office environment, probably less, but still that risk management process has to occur there as well. I'd like to thank you all for your time. Hopefully you've taken something out of the education that I've given you. Certainly get out there. If you're designing stuff, think about those risk assessments. If you're involved in engineering, engineering is a key, because when you design things, if you design with safety in mind, then you're cutting out a lot of those other things, that when something's in place in the workplace, then it's already safe. You know, it's already got things so people aren't having to use sustained postures, lift things, put their hands into things. So I wish you all well, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
That was pretty clear, easy to hear.
So I took like this one.